to the first in this winter's series of ConTrust Speaker Series lectures. Our guest tonight is Professor James Yékú from the University of Kansas at Lawrence, I would guess. And he's currently, however, hailing from Berlin as a Humboldt Fellow at Humboldt University, where he works on questions that are directly relevant to our research here, and questions that have also been addressed in his most recent book, which has created quite a splash and has become an important reference both in media and culture studies and in political science. The book is called Cultural Netizenship, and it's about social engagement and political engagement in online communities, with a particular focus on Nigeria. James Yékú earned his doctorate from the University of Saskatchewan in Canada. I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly. He taught at the University of Ibadan in Nigeria and at Saskatchewan before moving to Kansas, I think in 2018-19. Yeah, something like that. James' profile includes a lot of important work on in the field of digital humanities, and the work on political online communities, of course, also comes out of that. That's where the methodologies were partly developed. One of his projects that he was involved in was a DH project, Digital Humanities Project, which mapped the literary canon onto the city map of London, a wonderful, as they're called, distant reading project that gives us a sense of patterns in large literary corpora that we would normally miss if we just read the book. But if we let the computer do the work, then we see more, and that's also part of what makes your work on political online community so interesting. I should mention that James is also a poet and a writer, and has published his writings, and two more things that make him particularly suitable to the ConTrust research culture. He's interested in cuisine and cooking and football, or as it says on your American website, soccer, but that's just for the people who don't really get it. So thank you for accepting our invitation. Very much looking forward to tonight's talk, which is Nigerian digital humor and the cultural politics of public trust. The floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you so much. That was very kind. And I'd like to thank very especially Tobias for the opportunity to come here. And I'm hoping that after tonight, there'll be opportunity for feedback and something very tangible to take away from Frankfurt also. I should say that this is my second time in this particular room. I was there 6 years ago for, I think it was another Cluster of Excellence project, Normative Order, and I presented a paper. As a matter of fact, the book I eventually wrote, Cultural Netizenship, which you referred to, came out of that particular presentation in a way. I was wrapping up my PhD, and the interest was to think about how cultural productions had something to tell us about online activism. So while most of the papers seem to be focused on international politics, political science, I was one of the few who wanted to explore notions of culture and aesthetic forms, especially as they intertwine with modes of activism online. I think my paper was titled The Performative Supplements of Online Activism, drawing a bit from Derrida, and just trying to think about how people post cultural and aesthetic forms online to invigorate their modes of political expressions. So that work eventually became Cultural Netizenship. And I thought I would begin with that for this particular talk, because in a lot of ways, cultural netizenship built on a concept that is much dated in the cultural and media studies landscape, especially in the West. And of course, not about netizenship, which came out from Colombia in the 90s when Michael Alban and a few others were trying to understand the internet as a then. What I do with cultural netizenship is to build on that particular concept, but also to try to explore how people would rather post, again, visual, satirical, and aesthetic forms online as modes of, as ways of engaging in political conversations online, political and cultural conversations, as a matter of fact. So netizenship might be dated in the Anglophone context, but in many ways it has remained theoretically agile in Asian contexts, right? And I think that's because of, again, the autocratic dimensions of the state in some of those particular, territories and regions. And for me, netizenship was necessary as something that can be recruited to understand, again, modes of cultural affiliations on the internet. It allowed me to focus on the effective and performative power of visually expressed citizenship on social media. And just to think about how people translate digitally modes of citizenship that rely on various acts of performances, which push the boundaries of citizenship beyond its normative understanding. And I'm thinking about, the work of Engine and Sane on acts of citizenship. And basically my interest would be to look at the cultural dimensions of these digital acts of citizenship you find in online contests. More importantly, I've been interested in cultural netizenship because these textual and media practices that circulate on social media, like internet memes, protest selfies, and other visual signs, for me, function in the context of post-colonial Nigeria in terms of what the late feminist scholar Lauren Ballant calls the counter-politics of the silly objects. So yeah, for me, the idea of silliness becomes conceptually foregrounded. Just to think about how cultural netizens as cultural producers on social media organizes so-called silly images, internet memes and selfies into popular assemblages for social and political critics. And the beautiful thing about them is how these forms like memes, GIFs, and what have you draw on existing media forms and basically come to express the most immediate and condensed mode of cultural and political commentary. In the context of the Russian and Ukraine war, some months ago, for instance, which is still ongoing, you would be surprised to find people sharing memes, including state officials from Ukraine sharing memes to push back against Russian propaganda. With the Israel-Hamas conflict, you find a lot of memes on both sides that speak to the particularities of this complex, situation. I think that's important, right? Why some people would rather trust these popular images, would trust forms of digital culture to say the unsayable, if you like. And for me, it's an example of how conflict might produce some kind of trust, even if it's, in this case, between human and non-human, entities. So I'm thinking here about why digital objects, digital artifacts, internet memes, online popular forms will be trusted to articulate that which is, ordinarily difficult to express. As a matter of fact, in a Nigerian context, you would imagine how a profound conflict, such as the NSAS protests of about 3 years ago, actually began on the basis of trusts. The police began to arrest anybody who carried a backpack and who had a laptop or who had some kind of, technological object that signaled some kind of modernity, like technological modernity. You were suspected to be some kind of online scammer. So the police went around town and a young person they saw, they arrested them, right? So this produced millions of tweets online, on Twitter specifically. And for me, it was a movement that started again, on the basis of issues of trust and mistrust. So how do cultural productions, jokes online, Instagram comic forms become mobilized to mediate these processes? Those are the kind of things I think about sometimes in the context of cultural netizenship. But again, I'm taking for granted that the issue of platform capitalism is something that, of course, we do need to keep in mind. The fact that the spaces are not neutral, the fact that big tech captures value from what people post online. So there's obviously all of that. And of course, the images people circulate online also feed into the system of disinformation and misinformation online. So there's all of those critiques ongoing, and I'm taking all of those for granted. Just to focus, briefly on how, despite all of these neoliberal anxieties around platformization and its extractive logics, people still, find these spaces quite generative for their counter politics. And I think that's something we don't often emphasize a lot. So when Elon Musk, for example, took over Twitter, a lot of people in the global north thought the world was coming to an end. There was this apocalyptic frenzy, which I think was not shared by many people in the global south, because that space remains very important for them as, as an important terrain for all kinds of, political pushback against authoritarian cultures around the world. So just to summarize cultural netizenship, which is the first aspect of my talk, I see the interactions between the state and citizen through the lens of popular culture. And that's what cultural netizenship allows me to do. So youth digital engagement, for instance, is something I come to by focusing on the unruly flows of silly images on the internet. Basically, I just, focus on internet memes, focus on GIFs and other kinds of online popular culture that you find on TikTok, Instagram, and most of these other platforms. As a theory of citizens' participation in the public sphere through the production and circulation of popular culture on digital connection networks, cultural netizenship gives this ability to just understand the kind of speech that becomes, particularly disruptive online. Jodin is famously, cited as saying the internet, social media in particular, fosters a noisy and one-sided communication that affects nothing online. And again, I think it's one of those critiques of the internet that often misses particular context and, the nuances of specific regions, because there are many places where the kind of activities people perform online, whether cultural or just blatantly political, all of these activities are not always noisy in places where the mere capacity to appear in the public is not always guaranteed, right? So again, there's always, at times, this Western-centric critiques that emerge when we just circulate on the single narratives about social media and the other digital platforms we inhabit. Again, I may make these critiques while conceding that there's the obvious case of platform capitalism and all of those things. And I try to keep those in mind. But I'm saying despite this algorithmic, and this datafication we have, algorithmic culture and datafication we have on our hand, people still find a way to subvert the machine. And as a matter of fact, we don't necessarily need to posit a binary between algorithms and humans. We just need to understand how these relationships are complex and, they overlap and people find a way to subvert machinic systems. But of course, I do need to say that the role of digital humor in Nigerian democracy is something I take seriously in my work. And that's because there's been in recent years a growing satisfaction with economic institutions in many parts of the world, Africa especially. Also with democratic institutions also. In the last 1 year, there's been coups and, in the West, in the Sahel region, and you just wonder what exactly is happening. I think there's this dissatisfaction. One theory, I think, I'm not a political scientist, but I think one thing has to do with corruption, right? Corruption seems to be a big deal, from where I stand. And I want to think very briefly here about how a culture of corruption fosters a climate of distrust. And in this climate, obviously, what you find is that conflict and trust are almost always already oppositional, right? And I believe for trust to manifest from such a conflictual setting or social space in which conflict and trust are oppositional, the structural and cultural conditions that make something like corruption a normative everyday reality needs to be tackled first of all. I understand the ConTrust project is interested, among other things, in how trust might be derivative from complex situations, manifest from conflictual frameworks, and I think that's possible in the context of a country such as Nigeria, which is really corrupt. You do need to tackle and address some structural realities before you even think about the emergence of trusts from a conflictual space. The point, I think, therefore, is to consider how in certain spaces, the relationship between trust and conflict is therefore almost always oppositional. And I think the Nigerian example offers that possibility. But again, issues of trust are at the heart of Nigerian politics and culture. And I think one of the ways they manifest in several ways, but one is through the politics of fakery, right? Which again goes back to what can be trusted. Nigerian president, for example, recently it was cleared by the country's highest court after about 8 months of litigation in court. Nobody trusted the process that brought him into power. And the funny thing is that apart from this president, the president before him claimed to have written some secondary school examination. There was no certificate. There was debate about his certification, right? Before him, the president before him, so 3 presidents in a row, the one before this, the last one also claimed to have written a PhD dissertation somewhere. Nobody has seen it. So you find this at that state level, this issue of trusts always almost aligned with political actors. In an environment such as the one I've described, people do not trust politicians and state actors. And the narratives about these actors and the processes entangled with them find their ways into symbolic forms online, and of course in other spaces. In Nigeria, for instance, things like fake drugs, fake motor parts, fake documents are therefore, the order of the day. And of course, there's a huge underground economy around this. I have a friend, as a matter of fact, who did some kind of research on fake documents, and he actually went to some guys and produced a fake death certificate. So he's alive, but he has a fake death certificate because there's a huge market for those kind of things. In the context of officialdom, Nigerians do not trust most things, not politicians, not especially documents that emanate from official culture. So in the context of the last election, therefore, people went online again to protest through comic forms, through other, more traditional forms of online activism. The hashtag all eyes on the judiciary, trended for weeks in the days after the election. And it was basically to say that we, the young people, savvy digital actors are watching the government. They do not trust the judiciary to come up with a clean process. So all eyes on the judiciary began to trend. I think the hashtag in its unruliness gives citizens the opportunity to use social media to discipline and regulate the power of the states and of course, state actors. But the hashtag is also an expression of the lack of trust in state actors and public institutions. And that's why something like, all eyes on the judiciary will be trending. Beyond the court and the judiciary, the police itself probably is symptomatic of this tense culture of distrust between the Nigerian state and its citizens. I would argue, along with many others, that the police in the Nigerian context is probably the most brutal, face of the violence of post-colonial power in Nigeria, and to even tacitly invoke the work of Agamben and think about the precariousness of life, the disposability of life as bare and barren, would not be to overstate the reality of things when it comes to police brutality in the Nigerian context. So as a means of repairing trusts, some time ago, the Nigerian police came up with a motto, this campaign to say the police is your friend. And that became of interest to me because I thought it was ironic. Because the very avowal of that assertion, the police is a friend, comes from a deep-seated sense of mistrust, right, between the state and its citizen. One that recognizes a sense of enmity and perennial conflict between the police apparatus in Nigeria and its citizens. I thought it was problematic for the state to assert itself as, or in terms of friendship. And there's a whole literature on friendship and strangeness, even in the context of political theory we could draw from. But in my thinking about this, I find the work of Zygmunt Bauman very generative. And it helped me to think about how Nigeria is faced with a problematic assertion of police power through mechanisms of coercion that produces a flagrant disregard for procedural justice. Yes, the expression, the police is a friend, therefore shows how the state has historically created an estrangement between itself and citizens who encounter it ambivalently as an obvious site of brutality. As citizens perform resistance in the age of social media, however, the site of police aggression and violence become even more visible. And this is not because police officers in Nigeria wear body cameras like their counterparts in the US, but because citizens are now well positioned to use platforms such as social media to surveil, shape, and performatively express their encounters with state coercion. In other words, the state-sponsored but subjective idea that the police is your friend, as the motto of Nigerian police articulate, is negated by the objective fact of people's lived experiences. The police can claim to be your friend, but when the police go about killing people, then the assertion of friendship becomes negated. To understand the nature of the post-colonial state in Nigeria, therefore, we can frame the enunciation of friendship by the Nigerian police apparatus through what Bauman describes as the phenomenon of strangerhood. So Zygmunt Bauman writes that they are friends and enemies, and that they are strangers. The stranger disturbs the resonance between physical and psychical distance, is physically close while remaining spiritually remote. It brings into the inner circle of proximity the kind of difference and otherness that are anticipated and tolerated only at a distance, where they can be either dismissed as irrelevant or repaired as hostile. In other words, the stranger represents an incongruous and hence resented synthesis of nearness and remoteness. That's the stranger. The police is a friend in this framework can be seen to orchestrate through a rhetorical practice that commands association, a remapping of this perception, that of the state as an enemy that cannot be trusted. So thinking of police access means we may read the state as presenting an exclusionary logic, which devalues and even strengthens the lives of many innocent citizens. The police is a friend, therefore misreads how friends are called into being by the pragmatics of cooperation, something the police in Nigeria desires of citizens. The police in Nigeria desires friendship with citizens, but also undermines this through its own brute display of organized and vindictive practices that impose fear on the public. The avowal of friendship is, again, like I said earlier, pertinent as it ironically offers what should be self-evident as a condition of public trust, right? The police should naturally be your friend. But again, the fact that you have to problematically state and make that point immediately negates the point you're trying to make, right? Anyway. So the paradox is evident in the assertion of friendliness by state agents who give reasons to mistrust the state. To accept the friendship of the state is both to misrecognize the troubled morality that undercut its excesses of power and to refute the perspective of the post-colonial state as a site of estrangement. It is also to uncritically affirm the workings of a state ideology that is empty in its rhetoric, but forceful in the way it encroaches violently upon the public through barbaric acts of police brutality. The kind that basically prompted the NSAS movement of 3 years ago. And the NSAS movement was a big thing. I mean, after this feast must fall in South Africa, there's been Bring Back Our Girls in Nigeria 2014. The NSAS movement was probably bigger than both movements in terms of the number and the sheer amount of data produced by that particular movement. And all of this was in response to police brutality, especially by young people who took to social media to protest the state and its simultaneous offer of friendship and violent, forms of power. I think it was Barbara Mister who reminds us that belief is essential to trust. She says, quote, "Trust is to believe despite uncertainty." But the precariousness and uncertainty around policing in Nigeria means the Nigerian police cannot be trusted. So, for example, in Lagos some weeks ago, some people actually had to beat off a policeman who was alleged to have pushed someone into an oncoming bus. The police officer denied having done that, but nobody trusted him, and they basically just beat up the poor guy. Like other aspect of state, power, the police institution is a site in which public trust and conflict are locked in unabating adversarial tensions, and all of this again negates the avowal of friendship by the states. Now, the point for me is how all of these materials and all of these tensions between citizens and the state, especially through the police institution, find their way into cultural productions, how they provide materials for people who want to make money on social media. And I say people want to make money. I'll come to that shortly, because it's really important to understand why people would want to risk their lives. They want to engage with a very brutal state institution. But again, to go back to cultural netizenship or symbolic forms more generally, I think they provide significant insight into the crisis of states and of trust in the Nigerian state, the crisis of fakery and what have you. So normally public trust would legitimize governance, but in Nigeria, such confidence in the political elite and government is not always guaranteed, right? And just to make that point, the anthropologist Daniel Jordan Smith talks about every household is on government. And Nigeria has this fantastic book titled Every Household is on Government. And the idea was to think about how citizens have to provide their own social amenities in Nigeria. They have to provide their own road. They have to provide their own electricity, right? Every household becomes a government. And again, how that becomes manifest in the space of cultural productions is something that is also very interesting. So what you have essentially is the ascendancy of private actors because of state failure and because of the distrust of governmental actors. And people know that the government would not provide road, water, and the basic necessities of life. So what do? They provide those things themselves. To go to these cultural producers online, therefore, they know that the government would not provide jobs. The unemployment figures in Nigeria is something that is, astronomically high. So a lot of people, and again, this is one of the reasons I'm very conservative when I criticize social media. And this is the thought I'll probably say it. Platform capitalism is real. People always think one, overvalorizes, overestimate the power of social media. It's like there's this techno-deterministic anxiety you have about optimism you have about social media. Yes, there's all of that, but there's also the fact that people who do not have jobs, who cannot trust the government to provide, employment for them, provide employment for themselves. So they go to social media and make comic skits. One of the comedians, I don't know if I have do you want to go to the next slide? If I have a picture, yeah, the next thing. And this guy says he makes about 20 million monthly as a skit maker, just to, make people laugh on TikTok and Instagram. 20 million naira is about 15 million euros in Germany every month. When I think about it, I just ask myself if I shouldn't actually be a skit maker. I should, take my TikTok calling more seriously. But it's a big deal. If the government cannot be trusted to provide, employment, you go online and you essentially just make this skits, make this comic materials available to people. And the process, the product of that process is that these producers of cultural and symbolic, forms online become influential actors, so-called social media influencers, right? And the figure of the social media influencer is something to be taken seriously in the context of fledgling democratic spaces such as the one you have in Nigeria. How do people who produce comic content on TikTok and Instagram become political actors? How do they become? CNN wanted to interview, people during the NSAS movement, and they didn't go to organized civil society. They went to some of these guys because they have this huge following on Twitter and TikTok. They seem to have taken over the civic space in very interesting and profound ways, such that we do need to begin to rethink the relationship between a state that is irresponsible, corrupt on the one hand, and a citizenry that used to be uncaring. But, through digital platforms and through cultural production that circulate in some of these platforms, are pushing back against the various excesses of the states. So some of these guys become influencers who can rally the audiences in online contests to protest police brutality. I'm choosing to show just images rather than videos and actual comics, because I think it will take a whole lot to explain cultural nuances and context. We can watch one or two videos if we want, but I thought I would just stay with images. The comic works they produce enable an understanding of the relationship between power and popular images, for sure. But there's also more. Cultural netizens, these cultural producers online, create social consciousness through the works they produce. On the other hand, the social consciousness also activates the creation of cultural text. Just being more politically conscious influence and shapes the way people actually produce, what they produce and how they produce this work. It's this, this paradox of digital connectivity. The internet or social media can amplify radical voices, but can also depoliticize, radical voices, depending on what one chooses to focus on. My point basically, as I try to bring all of this together, is to think about how young people in Nigeria use social media to mediate their encounters with the states. How do you encounter the state, especially when you have a repressive state apparatus such as the Nigerian police? And how cultural productions, symbolic forms, online popular culture play a crucial role in shaping the kind of narratives produced by young people online. But, of course, it is always in the nature of power to fight back. I think it was Goethe who said, where there's power, you always have resistance, and the resistance, more power. The reinscription of power is always almost with us. So for some of these guys, they also make themselves visible, right, through social media. It's like this panopticon all over again. You fight against a repressive apparatus, and then you make yourself visible, right? And then the police comes, the state comes for you. And again, that makes even more complex that relationship, that oppositional dynamics between the states and citizens. 3 years after the NSAS protest, and the NSAS protest, by the way, did not just happen online. It was also on the streets of Lagos. People went to the street, which is worth emphasizing, just to emphasizing just to, press that point that there's always that connection between offline and, online spaces. We tend to think of this movement as almost always domiciled online, but they actually, go to the streets sometimes. In the context of Nigeria, they went to the streets and a number of people were killed, right? The state basically shot at people who were protesting police brutality, the irony. But the point I want to make is 3 years after answers, that people in prisons in Lagos who have not had a day in courts, right? Just because they went out to protest. So what's the point? The point is to address or to decenter that oppositional dynamic between the state and citizens. That lack of trust, that idea that trust and conflict cannot be reconciled in the Nigerian context. We do need to go back to the cultural backdrop that produces that, or that continues to sustain that, right? Therefore, and this is my conclusion, if the Nigerian state or the Nigerian cultural ecology would offer a neat example for the emergence of trust from conflictual settings, we do need to go back to the structural dynamic that sustain, that oppositional tension in the first place. So one of the comedians, the one before, I think, one of the comedians whose work, is out there, was recently arrested by the Nigerian police. And it's probably in the video. I chose not to show. Maybe we can come back to that later in the Q&A. It was arrested by the Nigerian state officials for producing a comic content mocking the Nigerian police. So again, you have this intensification of that relationship, that's breakdown of trust. That's, it's both mistrust and distrust at the same time. You have people who know that differences cannot be reconciled. So because you do not trust the state, you basically want to ridicule them and awfully, push them into some kind of political action. And the state fights back by arresting you, and then the tension basically continues. So for me, and that's my last point, for the relationship between trust and conflict to be more generative and productive in a corrupt setting, predominantly corrupt setting such as Nigeria, we do need to address the cultural and structural factors that anchor this thing in the first place. Thank you so much.